Good evening, and welcome to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum. My name is Will Parsons, and I'm a member of the John F. K. Jr. Forum Committee here at the Institute of Politics. Before we begin, please note the exit doors, which are located directly behind you and on the JFK Street side of the forum. In the event of an emergency, please gather your belongings, move to the exit closest to you, and congregate in the JFK Park. Please also take a moment now to silence all cell phones. You can join the conversation tonight online by tweeting with the hashtag Pritzker Forum, which is also listed in your program. Please take your seats now and join me in welcoming our guests, Secretary Penny Pritzker and Professor Nicholas Burns.
Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Nick Burns, professor here at the Kennedy School, and it's a great pleasure for me to welcome Penny Pritzker back to Harvard. I say back to Harvard because Penny was an undergraduate here, graduated with her very good friend, Liz Sherwood. Penny then went on to that other American university across the country, Stanford. She's a graduate of the law school and the business school there. And she's returning as a Klein Fellow in economic diplomacy. Professor Larry Summers and I have created this program. We have this radical belief that national security should not be just the preserve of diplomats and generals and secretaries of defense like Secretary Ash Carter, who's also just come back to Harvard, but should be about economics and trade and commercial diplomacy. That's a modern way of looking at the health of the United States and the arsenal of the United States. We had Christine Lagarde here a month ago. Penny is our second Klein Fellow. We're very proud that she's here. And in a way, I view Penny as a perfect model for what our Kennedy School students should be, because she has done so much in her career. She's been an entrepreneur and builder of businesses, PSP Capital and the Pritzker Realty Group and other businesses besides that over the last 3 decades. She's been a noted public servant because, you know, she was Secretary of Commerce for President Obama. She's also a civic leader and a philanthropist. Penny and her husband live in her native Chicago, and Chicago is a city with great wealth and excitement and a big business community, but also a troubled city in many ways. And Penny and her husband have been looking at what they can do to help improve the condition on the south side of Chicago for young kids especially, and to give them opportunities. So she is worthy, I think, of emulation by our students. And this morning she met with some of our students who are active in our diplomacy program. She met with young women here to talk about careers. She's been meeting members of the faculty, so we're delighted that she's back. And we're going to have a conversation.
I look forward to that.
No speeches, just a conversation. And then we'll open it up, as we always do, to questions. There are microphones on the floor and microphones in the 2 balconies. Penny and I talked this morning. I thought we should start at the beginning. You and your mom and dad were in California in the first years of your life, and you were a businesswoman at the age of 4, 5, and 6. And I just wanted to, so it's in your DNA, maybe have you talk a little bit about how you got started in business.
So when I was just a baby, my dad moved out to California because my family had bought a motel by the Los Angeles airport. And literally my mom and dad and I was 6 or 8 months old, moved into the motel, and as my mother used to say, she used to walk the stroller on the sidewalk that was near the landing strip at the airport. And my dad was learning the motel business and was building a chain of motels up and down the west coast of California and the west coast of the United States. And so literally my childhood was growing up with where the family dinner conversation was about building a business. And it was a full family affair. My mother was not formally employed by the company, but she was in charge of all the decor, of the uniforms, of taking care of the secretaries, and I don't mean secretaries of commerce, I mean the secretaries that were supporting the executives. And the room that we're in today is probably 3 times or 4 times the size of the corporate office at that time. So literally our dinner table conversation was about building this business. And I think it's why I'm a builder at heart. I think that really left an imprint on me. And I used to go on the weekends with my dad to the office, and he would talk on the phone and I would play on the adding machine. I explain this to my children. They have no clue what an adding machine is. And the idea that you had a machine that did that and it wasn't part of your phone and it wasn't part of something else is just an anathema to them. But basically, and then we would walk across the street and there was our motel by the San Francisco airport, and I'd go in the girls' room and my dad would go in the men's room and check it out and make sure it was clean. So literally this, on Sundays we would go to the restaurant for dinner, make sure the food was good. So it was really a family affair. And then in about 1967, we had the opportunity, the family, to open a hotel in Atlanta. And that really became the beginning of what is today Hyatt Hotels, the modern Hyatt Hotels. But it was an extraordinary experience. Unfortunately, I lost my dad when I was 13 and my mother about 10 years later. And my mom really never recovered because she both lost her partner and her best friend, but also her job and her identity. And so that was a real loss for her in her life. But that was kind of the environment within which I grew up.
And when you came to Harvard as a freshman, was business in your future? Were you here to prepare for a business career?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Liz and I joke, I was all in on economics and she was all in on government. And I tried to take Gov 10 and Gov 30 and it was sort of a disaster for me. But I knew since I was like 5 years old, I saw this idea of building a business as a noble purpose, as creating jobs, as doing something that had noble intentions and noble outcomes. And so I was excited to do that. It was not about financial engineering. It was about actually building things.
So you weren't interested, as a lot of our students now are looking at hedge funds and private equity, venture capital. It's lucrative, it's exciting, but you were interested in actually building things and building a traditional business.
I like, building businesses, managing, determining a plan and a set of objectives, and then going out and trying to accomplish those.
So you left Harvard, you went to Stanford, you then went back to Chicago. You had a very powerful uncle running a business, you had cousins. You were the only woman in that environment, one of the few women in the professional capacity.
So 1985, around November, I show up in Chicago. I knew I wanted to work with my family members, but it was an all-male environment. There were no women except secretaries. And there were no female executives. There weren't even women in the ranks, really. So it was, as I like to say, I couldn't eat in the dining room. I couldn't park in the garage. And my grandfather, who was a real inspiration to me, and someone who, as a young person, I had reached out to after my dad died to sort of teach me about business. His secretary calls me my first day at work and she said, "Your grandfather is so proud of you. He's really excited you're here and he's really glad you're not working in his office." And I thought, he had told me when I was 16 years old, I had written him a letter for his 80th birthday. My mother said, "You can give your grandfather anything you want for his birthday." I'd written him a letter and said, "How come you only talk business to the boys in the family and not to me?" And he had responded by saying to me in the middle of this party for his birthday, he called me and took me in the hallway and he said, "I was born in 1896. How am I supposed to know girls are interested in business?" And in a funny way, it was a very honest answer. He didn't know, but he always encouraged me, and so did my uncle. But the reality of the environment, it was quite male dominated. So the way that I ultimately tried to deal with that was to go and to become an entrepreneur, to start businesses rather than to try and fit in, because I couldn't figure out the fitting in part.
So what businesses did you have your sights on?
So in 1987, 2 years out of graduate school and full of energy, I started a business in senior living. My parents had passed away. I was the primary caregiver for my grandmother, and I realized that what an impossible task that was, as particularly as more and more women were in the workforce. How do you care for your aging parents and actually be in the workforce? There was a new opportunity of services to be born. And so I created a company called, with the support of my family, Classic Residence by Hyatt. And, we started that company, as I said, in the late 80s. And 1992, there was a housing crisis. We all think about 2007, but 1992, there was a housing crisis, and people couldn't sell their homes and couldn't move in. And the business was not doing very well. And I thought the world was ending. I was panicked about letting everyone down. And I went to my uncle, who was chairman of everything. And I basically said to him, I think we should, I had learned in business school about opportunity cost and sunk cost. And I said, I think we should just liquidate the business that isn't going to work. And fortunately, he had some wisdom and perspective. And he said, why don't we take this 6 to 12 months at a time? And he really understood this aging demographic that was coming to our country, and that this would be a business with a great opportunity. It just needed time. And so he didn't fire me and didn't let me liquidate the company, but today it's a thriving business employing thousands of people.
So one of the things that stood out, Penny and I met with a lot of our students for breakfast, and we went around the room and asked each student, why are you here? What did you do before you came to the Kennedy School? And a large percentage of them had been in business, some type of business between college and graduate school. And this has traditionally been a school that educates people for public service, but increasingly our students here want a hybrid career. Our students want to work in the private sector and the public sector. Did you have that ambition when you started out? Did you think that public service, civic service might be in your future?
Well, I was raised in a household where the mantra was, to whom much is given, much is expected. And so my mother was involved in local Democratic politics, and my dad was supporting candidates as they were running. John Tunney was running for senator in California.
Yeah.
My mother and father, but really my dad was his finance chair. And I didn't really know this, but I learned this after my dad died. My dad's ambition was ultimately, he had built Hyatt and taken it public. He wanted to quit the private sector and run for office. And so I think it was in my DNA, and it certainly was in the DNA of our household, to be involved civically and be involved in our community, and to try and play some kind of role in helping others.
And then eventually you got to know a young lawyer in Chicago named Barack Obama. Tell us about your first meetings with him, how you got to know him, your support of him in the 2008 campaign.
Well, all of us know that, or those of us who are old enough to have children at least, know that we meet all kinds of people through our children. And my kids wanted to play basketball. I'm short. I don't know anything about basketball. I was in high school before Title IX. So, this is not something I knew something about. Anyway, so I asked a friend of mine, Marty Nesbitt, who was working for me at the time, I said, how do you do basketball for children? And he said, come to the Lincoln Belmont Y this weekend. There's this great coach that is going to coach all of our kids, and we're going to play basketball. That coach being Craig Robinson, Michelle Robinson's brother. And so Barack and Michelle used to hang out on the sidelines of the YMCA court watching their nieces and nephews, Craig's kids, play basketball and watching Craig coach. And that's how we met. So it was not some grand, predetermined meeting. It was really serendipity. And then we have a home in Michigan to get out of the city on the weekends. And Craig came because I really was interested in getting to know him better. That he was a guy who was in finance but was coaching young kids in basketball, and this fabulous leader, and he really believed in treating kids like adults. and teaching them life lessons through basketball. And so he came up to the house and he says, you know, my sister and brother-in-law would love to come up here sometime. And I said, great, next year, next summer, let's invite them too. And so we used to spend weekends on the summer, and that led to, you know, a weekend a year, and that led to, you know, dinners and conversations. And we got to know each other. And then when Barack decided to run for the Senate, he asked Brian and I if we would support him. And we said, okay, let us think about it. We went out for a run the next day, and the two of us are talking over our while we're running along and said, he doesn't have a chance. No way this is going to happen. But he's the kind of guy you'd love to see in government.
This is his 2004 run?
2004 run. You know, here's a man with extraordinary integrity. He's a constitutional law professor. He's got an amazing story. He's committed to the community. And geez, you know, they're a wonderful couple. This is the kind of person you'd love to see in the Senate. Let's support him even though he doesn't have a chance. So we go back and we tell him we're going to support him, and we helped him in his election to the Senate. And then 2006, about, you know, October of 2006, Valerie Jarrett and Marty Nesbitt invite me to lunch, and we sit down to lunch, and they said, Barack would like you to be his finance chair for his run for the presidency. And I was like, you gotta be kidding me, really? I've got a career, I've got 2 kids, I'm trying to hold, you know, be a good spouse, I'm under contract to my family, we're doing this restructuring, and I'm go on and on. Anyway, they said, think about it. So I go home that night, and I walk in the kitchen, and Brian, my husband's standing there, and I said, you won't believe what, you know, Valerie and Marty raised with me. And I said, there's just no way. And I start with all the reasons why I can't do this. And Brian starts knocking on the door of our kitchen door. And I said, what are you doing? And he said, this is destiny knocking on the door of our country. Wow. My husband is known for the dramatic flair. And he's really good at it, and I'm not. Anyway, so he said, you've got to find a way. So that night at dinner, because we believed, you know, we have 2 children, we believe in talking to our children as, you know, adults. And we said to him, here's what Barack is asking, and if I do this, it probably means, and I started saying, I won't be home on weekends, and I'll be gone probably another 50 nights a year more than I'm already gone. And so if I'm going to do this, everybody's got to be all in, because I'm not going to be able to show up at your basketball or, you know, games and things like that. I'm going to have to figure out how to balance this. And they said, oh, Mom, we're all in. And they were, and we were as a family. And so that's how I got involved in the campaign.
So before we get to commerce and your involvement in the administration, so when you made that decision, it's the autumn of 2006, mm-hmm. What was the probability in your mind that Barack Obama would get the nomination, much less win the presidency?
So
how uphill a battle was it?
So I don't have to give you the probability Barack did. Okay. I said to him, you know, then he and I sat down, and when I said to him, I said, you know, first of all, why do you think anybody is going to vote for you? How are you going to prove to people you have the management skills? I know you have the integrity. I know you have the intellectual chops. And I think you're a good leader, but how are you going to prove people you can manage a large organization? And how are you going to prove to people you have the national security experience, that people are going to trust you with this country? And, you know, so he talked about that. And then he also said to me, he said, look, Penny, here's the way I look at this race. I am a 1 in 5 shot. Hillary's a 2 in 5 shot. And the rest of the field is a 2 in 5 shot. So that's how he put the odds out.
So he won that smashing victory. You went to Washington, Secretary of Commerce. How did you look at that challenge? We were experiencing the worst recession in 65, 70 years. We had stratospheric 10+% unemployment, crisis in the capital markets. People were even talking about nationalizing the banks in the winter of 2009?
So 2009 to 2013, first term I did not serve. I couldn't. I was under contract to my family. We were in the middle of a big restructuring. And so I served on the President's Economic Recovery Advisory Board, and then I served on the Jobs Council. So I was an euphemistic outside advisor to folks in the administration. It was a terrifying time. I mean, particularly 2009, 10, 11, it was really scary. Our banking system came very close to collapse. And I was, particularly before he was inaugurated, I was on phone calls where it was really scary to understand the depth of crisis our country was in, and frankly, what we had, by selling the kind of financial instruments that we had to the rest of the world, how we had infected the financial system of the world. And one thing that was, we didn't elect Barack Obama for his economic prowess. We elected him for other things, and he was the first person to say it. But it was the classic good leader. He put really strong people around him. And, and whether it was Paul Volcker from the outside, Larry Summers on the inside, Austin Goolsbee and others to advise him on, how to deal with the economy. It was, he did what leaders should do. Find the best and the brightest in a crisis, and listen and try to, and he was bold. I mean, I remember when he went in and basically invested money into the auto industry, and I thought, oh my, what is happening to our market-driven system? It was absolutely the right move. I mean, not only did the federal government make money on the investment, it was a belief, basically what was understood was that our supply chain was at risk, and millions of jobs were at risk. So he took bold action, and that didn't surprise me for him as a leader, but he'd probably be the first to tell you originally he was not the economic president, but he sure came in and led.
So you served in this advisory capacity. The recession technically ended in, I think economists say, in 2011, but it really didn't end because so many people were hurting. And you became Secretary of Commerce. And tell us what your arrangement was with President Obama in terms of what you were both trying to accomplish in reviving the economy.
Well, at the time I came in, so unemployment was in the 7s at that time. It was in the 10s at the beginning of the Great Recession. So jobs were the issue. And today we're sitting at 4% or 4.2% unemployment. But jobs were the issue. And he said to me, look, here's the deal. His relationship with the business community was pretty raw at that point for a number of reasons, particularly the regulation of the financial sector, which was required in order to put it, more security in our financial sector. And we should be careful not to let that get rolled back too far, because we saw what can happen without the kind of regulation that's been put in place. And I'm not saying there hasn't been some that needs modification. I'm just saying don't forget the benefits that we've enjoyed. But he was focused on jobs. So what he said to me is, I want you to build a bridge to the business community. I want you to be the voice of business in our policy making, so in our economic policy as well as our national security policy. And then I want you to be the chief commercial advocate for American business and American jobs in the country. And and then he told me the bar was low. So, go try and figure out, he forgot to tell me it was this organization of 47,000 people and 12 different bureaus and a complex organization with many different activities. But he really had a vision of, we needed to repair our relationship with the business community so that they would feel more confidence, they would be investing more in the United States, and that would lead to greater job creation and greater opportunity for Americans, which is what he was really focused on.
And export promotion was one of his
Oh.
specific goals as president.
So we put together a plan, which I then went back to him with our strategic plan and a slide deck of what we wanted to accomplish. And our team came together and we said, there's really 5 things we're going to focus on at the Department of Commerce: trade and foreign direct investment, both of which are job creators for the United States. It's been kind of messed up by politics, but both of which are job creators. Innovation. Let's invest in advanced manufacturing. Let's invest in skills. Let's invest in our digital economy. Data. Let's make more of our data available. And finally, we have NOAA as part of the Department of Commerce. Let's make sure that our environmental intelligence is really where it needs to be. And then the final thing was, we're going to strive for operational excellence. And the president really pushed all of us in his cabinet to run our departments better, to be better managers. And so he blessed the plan, and off we went. And symbolically, one of the things that I was trying to communicate, both internally in the department as well as externally, is that the United States was open for business. So I had this sign made, and the first day that I came to the department, I hung a sign, like an old sign that you would see in a retail store, open for business, in the front. I was allowed to put one little nail in the, quote, historic wood, and
The Department of Commerce.
in the Department of Commerce,
Yeah.
and I hung this sign. So everyone going in and out of the office would know it was a symbol of, this is what we're about. We're about growing, that we're about creating the conditions for American businesses to create jobs.
So the first of those objectives you named was trade, and in a way it's ironic that President Obama ended up as the great pro-trade president, because since the Second World War it's been the Republican Party that almost has universally supported free trade. Democrats have been ambivalent at times about trade, the power of the unions and all that. But by the end of your time as Secretary of Commerce, working with President Obama and our good friend Mike Froman, your administration had proposed the Trans-Pacific Partnership, 40% of global GDP. You'd proposed, and we're working on, a difficult US-EU free trade agreement, the 2 largest economies in the world, 850 million people. And you hadn't questioned NAFTA, but you were obviously trying to modernize NAFTA and maintain it. We're now 10 months into the Trump administration in this extraordinary position where the president has said no to TPP and really got nothing for it. He didn't trade it for anything. The US-EU trade agreement is essentially dead.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of us thought he wanted to modernize NAFTA, but actually if you look at the last round that occurred in Washington in the last few weeks, it looks like the Trump administration might want to kill NAFTA. 23 years where it's lifted a lot of boats in North America and helped the economies of all 3 countries. We're looking at a revolution in trade policy in the United States, but it's not clear to me, beyond saying we're going to have bilateral trade agreements with 193 other states, where this is going and what the impact's going to be on the economy and our leadership role. Mm-hmm. So you talked to our students about this morning, and I think we'd like to hear your views on this and what you think of where President Trump is taking us.
Well, look, what I know about trade as a business person and as someone who's been in government, that trade expands our markets. 95% of consumers in the world and customers in the world are outside the United States. And the beneficiaries of trade agreements are predominantly small and medium-sized businesses. They are not, GE is going to be fine. Caterpillar knows how to get, they're big enough and they make equipment and things. They know how to work around the world. And the other thing I know is trade ties us to other nations and it reduces risk. And so trade also creates opportunity. I spoke with about 1,000 CEOs. I spoke with probably a couple thousand CEOs, but during my time at Commerce, probably 1,000 small if not 1,500 small and medium-sized business CEOs. And they said, I asked them, what do you want from the government? They said, we need a skilled workforce, and we need trade agreements, and we'd like tax reform. Those were the three things they were interested in. And I said, trade agreements. They said, well, in order for me to get that part that's a part of the bicycle that I'm making, I need that from someplace else. Or I make posters for hotels. I want to be able to sell my posters and my art around the world, but I'm facing a 30% tariff if I sell into Asia. Or I make, those televisions that sit in mirrors, they make those out in Oregon, and a company called Electric Mirror. And he's like, I've got a 30% tariff on my product if I sell it into Vietnam, whereas China has no tariff. So, but what's happened is that, political forces have been playing against the angst that the American people feel. And there is real angst by the American people, and we have not addressed that. And that angst is due to the fact it's not just globalization, it's also automation, artificial intelligence, and frankly, many of the jobs, the 15+ million jobs that were created post the Great Recession, are in the service industry and not in production jobs. We've lost, production jobs have grown. Manufacturing jobs grew about, call it 750,000 to 1 million jobs. So by definition, most of these jobs are in the service industry. There's less security and oftentimes less pay. I mean, I'll tell you the story I can tell you many stories of individuals. So the problem we've got is the gains from globalization has not been broadly shared. And we failed to come up with mechanisms to cushion the transition for someone who experiences a hardship because of either automation or globalization. So say you're a steel worker and you're affected by China dumping steel in the United States. We've already automated most of our steel plants, so there aren't a lot of jobs to be lost, but some were lost. And I met a bunch of these people. These are good, hardworking folks, and they're earning $25, $30 an hour, and they lose their job. And yes, they can find another job, but it's at $12 an hour. And I'm a family of 3, and my wife is a bank teller, and I live for, an hour outside of Cleveland, and what am I going to do? I want a job. I don't want to be on unemployment. I like working, but I can't, and this is the problem, the backdrop against which the solution that's being proffered by this administration is to get a lot tougher on our trade agreements. And I just don't agree with that. I think that, instead we should be doubling down on our trade agreements that provide opportunity for us to make and sell things around the world. So I think that the solutions that are being offered are tearing apart our relationships around the world, and I don't get it. You look at TPP. The Prime Minister of Singapore said to me last year in September, he said, look, we've all gone out on a limb for TPP. If you guys walk away from us in TPP, you will not be trusted in Asia for a generation. That's what we walked away from. I mean, I don't get it. If I were negotiating this, I would have said, okay, I told you in the campaign I hate TPP, but here are the 5 things that have to happen to make it a deal I would sign up for. Why not try the option?
Make it the Trump Trans-Pacific Partnership.
Why walk away from it? I don't understand what we're doing with Mexico and Canada. Right now, we are playing really hardball with these guys. And frankly, these are allies on our northern and southern border. A strong Mexico is in our best interest. A strong economic Mexico is not only in our economic interest, it's in our national security interest. And we're instead saying, we want to walk away from this because we're focused on trade deficits. Trade deficits are not caused by trade agreements. And somebody ought to go do the research and point that out. But instead, that is the mantra of this administration when it comes to trade. And, we can push some. We can, there's no doubt NAFTA needs to be modernized. In fact, if we recall, both Canada and Mexico were part of TPP. So an effective TPP was modernizing NAFTA without having to go back to a trilateral agreement. So I'm terribly concerned that what we're actually going to happen is that we're going to push, for example, Mexico too far. And in fact, in their presidential elections next year, they will go a very different direction. And the relationship along our southern border will be really tough and will make needing a wall a self-fulfilling prophecy, as opposed to, it's crazy. We should be building bridges with Mexico, not walls. And that's something actually we worked on really hard. And so I'm terribly concerned. And why are we picking a fight with Chorus right now? We need a strong relationship with South Korea. Dealing with North Korea is a complex situation. It requires us to deal with China, South Korea, and others. This is not my area of expertise. But why are we picking a fight with the South Koreans right this minute when there's a lot of vulnerability in that region? It just doesn't make sense to me.
The president threatened to leave the U.S.-South Korea free trade agreement right in the middle of the crisis about 6 weeks ago. It's what you're referring to. And I take that point. Is he right, however, about China artificially supporting its currency, ripping off the intellectual property of a lot of American and other companies? Do we need to have a tougher trade policy? How did you and President Obama, Ambassador David Thorne's here, who was also in the trenches, both as our ambassador in Italy, but also in the second term as advisor to Secretary Kerry on these issues? How did you think about dealing with China? Because we don't have a positive relationship on trade with them.
Well, here's the interesting thing, and let's keep this in mind before we go to the current situation. With the advent of TPP looking like it was a real possibility in 2014 or late 13, China said, we want a bilateral investment treaty. And they were close to actually getting that done when TPP fell apart. So, talk about the not understanding the connections between one action and another and the implications for our relationship with China by not following through with TPP is huge. So how were we dealing with China? We were dealing with China on many fronts, and I'll just talk about the economic front. And on the economic front, it was one, pursue TPP because that creates a counterbalance to China. Two is a very strong message about stealing our IP. You want to have, there's certain things you want to see happen. You cannot keep stealing the intellectual property of our companies. And in the last year, they backed off of that. The challenge we dealt with, and I think it's going to be really interesting post this party Congress, because during the party Congress and during President Xi's speech, he talked about, and I'm going to, the quote, he wants to ensure China has market-based allocation of resources and competition will determine whether a business survives. Those are not new words. Those words were in the third plenum and the fourth plenum, words written by Xi. So forgive me for my skepticism about that. But I think that the challenge is that they've stated that we're going to have state champions in certain industries. We're going to have champions in semiconductors, in clean energy, in other industries. And so I don't think you're going to see the kind of reform that we're talking about, that we would, their word reform and our word reform mean two different things. And that was the challenge of what we dealt with. I remember sitting with Vice Premier Wang Yang, who I had a really constructive working relationship with, and I'm glad to see he will continue in his position. He's a good counterparty, tough, but somebody we can work with and we have a relationship with. I'm glad to see that he's continuing. But, these are real big problems. The other issue is excess capacity. China produces so much excess steel. They produce about 400 million metric tons of excess steel. And to give you an idea, the United States consumes about 110 million metric tons of steel a year. So they produce 4 times extra steel than what we consume. And basically their strategy has been, we'll cut back some, but the rest of it we're going to export. And that's why One Belt, One Road has so many construction projects, because they intend to use their excess capacity through that and frankly through dumping. Now we've addressed the dumping through tariffs, but at the end that excess capacity needs to go away. These are some of the things that I think they'll make some effort to, but in the end they can't. They have 3 million workers in their steel industry, and they're fearful of unemployment because that will lead to social unrest. And I think stability is critical to China's, the current Chinese leadership's being able to execute on their goals and objectives.
Good. And we'll come back to this, including the question of whether the 11 existing members of the TPP might be able to hold things together before the United States returns to trade, but that looks like a vanishing hope, doesn't it?
Well, I'm worried. New Zealand just had an election of a government that is not in favor of TPP. So you're beginning to see the threads of TPP unravel. And with NAFTA, you're beginning to see that a TPP 11 looks different than what a NAFTA 2.0 does. And so it feels like it's becoming less and less a possibility to hold together. I don't want to damn it. I'm in favor of the TPP 11 coming together, even without the United States, with a hope that maybe someday in the future the United States may join. But that may be wishful thinking.
So Penny, 2 more questions, and then we'll go to questions from the audience. Ash and I are both members of the board of the Council on Foreign Relations. And the Council on Foreign Relations is concerned with the foreign policy of the United States. But the Council has asked you and the former governor of Michigan, Republican John Engler, to form a commission to look at the future of work. Because we believe that's really important for the security of the United States and the future of the United States. So we've got the emerging digital economy, artificial intelligence, the continued role of globalization, which will redefine the American workforce and opportunities and change the nature of work. Tell us about, you've just begun, but tell us about where you're heading in this.
Well, really the goal of this work is to say, what do we do about these forces that are undermining the average American's confidence that they can have a prosperous income and a prosperous role in society and a prosperous opportunity for jobs that they can support a family into the future with the forces of globalization and artificial intelligence and automation and the increase in use of robots. And the other force that's happening is an increase in the change in nature of work. We have 55 million Americans right now who earn their living through contract labor or being part of the gig economy. But we don't have a social safety net or a benefits that's structured to support that. And so this angst is real. And I don't think we can just gloss over it. And I think that the Council on Foreign Relations recognized, the leadership recognized, that we've got to address this angst that is undermining American sense of confidence in the world, and this reactive move to sort of pull back, which is what we're seeing, that's not good for American, not only economy and prosperity, but also not good for America's national security. And what was interesting, I met with the international board or advisory group to the council. They got it immediately. They said without hope, without the sense of potential, that leads to insecurity in society, and insecurity in society can really have very negative, deleterious effects when it comes to the stability of a country.
Thank you. Last question. In our meeting with students this morning, but also in the podcast interview that you and I did together, we discussed at some length the state of our politics 10 months into the Trump presidency. And we've had this extraordinary week of looking into a battle inside the Republican Party for the future of the party. John McCain's acceptance of the Liberty Prize in Philadelphia, and then and his remarks there. And then George W. Bush's speech in New York. And then, of course, remarks by President Obama as well when he was in Virginia last week. And then yesterday, a very extended interview with Senator Corker about President Trump, and then very dramatically, the speech on the floor of the Senate by Senator Jeff Flake of Arizona, announcing that he wouldn't run again beyond 2018, but also I think, a really brilliantly crafted speech on the meaning of America and of our civic discourse and of the bombastic, shrill nature of the debate in the red-blue divide. But all those people, especially the Republicans, are really pointing at the president, at his rhetoric, dividing us by race, name-calling, attitudes and actions that one does not associate with George H.W. Bush or Franklin Roosevelt or Dwight D. Eisenhower or Ronald Reagan, people of strong and great character who served in the Oval Office. And a lot of people have not wanted to address this. People didn't want to stoke partisanship. People in the party, Republican Party, didn't want to raise it. You've now had prominent people raise this. And I wonder what you think of this as a citizen of this country, and what you think we ought to do to create a more positive discourse at a really tough time for the country.
I don't think the issue that they're raising is about the discourse. I think the issue that they're raising is about character and about what's happening to our comfort level with the lack of facts prevailing, and that there seems to be that the United States of America has always been a beacon for our values. And right now, I think what you're hearing from these folks is our behavior is inconsistent and our words are inconsistent with the values of the American people. And ultimately, at the end of the day, we're a democracy. We need to reflect the American people. And I think right now we have the 80% of Americans who, and Secretary Carter and I were talking about this earlier, 20% of our population is speaking for 80%. And I think it's not reflective of the values that our country stands for. It's certainly not reflective of the Constitution. It's not reflective of the kind of integrity that we've behaved with in the past. And so I think that you're seeing people stand up within the Republican Party and say, we need to course correct here significantly. But right now, this is the leadership team that we have, and it's a very scary time, I think, because I was in Washington the beginning part of the week, and our allies are asking themselves, can they trust us in the future? Can they know whether, if the United States of America says they're going to do something, they're actually going to do it from administration to administration? And we have to have a serious conversation about who are we as a country, not both domestically, what do we stand for, what are our attitudes about leadership, about race, about inclusive growth, and about are we reliable to our allies around the world. And all of those issues have been raised by virtue of what's gone on over the last 7 or 8 months.
Right. And as we were talking earlier today, at the most critical moments in the country's history over the last century and a half, Lincoln led us out of the Civil War by trying to unify us. FDR brought us through the Great Depression, the Second World War. Martin Luther King brought us through the 1960s and redeemed the promise of the Declaration of Independence. Here's what Senator Flake, I just want to leave you with this and ask for your comment before we go to questions. Senator Flake ended, he's a Republican, his speech on the floor yesterday by quoting from Lincoln's first inaugural. And here's the quote: "We are not enemies," Lincoln talking to the Confederacy, "but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break the bonds of our affection. The mystic chords of memory will swell when again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature." I mean, it's one of the most brilliant 2 or 3 sentences in American history. Can we find that union between red and blue America? But more pertinently, can the president decide that he's going to be a uniter rather than a divider?
I, like President Obama, am a believer in the American people. And I think that we will find our better angels, but we're being tested.
We certainly are. Thank you for being with us, and thank you for answering all my questions. We appreciate it. Now it's over to you. Please let us know who would like. We have 2 people here. Yes, sir. And please just identify yourself, what you're studying here if you are a student. The only stipulation here is that there's a question mark at the end, and we'll go from there. Thank you. Yes, we can hear you.
My name is Shota. I'm a student here. I'm studying international relations. I also work for childrenforamerica.org. And my question is the following. We all know that the incomes have been stagnant since 1980s in the U.S. for middle-class Americans. So it's been over 35 years. So what can be done to change that? Maybe we need to shift budget from the Defense Department, or do something else, maybe apprenticeships. So what is your answer to that?
Well, I think the United States needs a competitiveness plan. And I don't mean a planned economy, but a competitiveness plan. I think, we know what we need to do. We just need to do it. We need to invest in our infrastructure. We need to invest in innovation. We cannot cut back on R&D. That has been part of the leadership of this country and part of significant to our prosperity. We need, frankly, to deal with comprehensive immigration reform. There's a moral component to that. We have 11 million people living in our country that we need to do something about, besides just up and deport people who've been a part of our communities for more than a decade. And certainly it's the children of those folks. The DACA kids absolutely are parts of our community. But we also have an economic opportunity with immigration. We're short people with certain skills. We're educating those folks in our universities here at Harvard and around the rest of the country. 50% of our STEM-trained folks are from another country. Why don't we ask those folks to stay and help us build our businesses here? We need to have trade. Trade creates opportunity. Training and workforce. We need a plan. We need to, not just apprenticeships, which it's one thing I do agree with Trump about, is 5 million apprenticeships. That's a great goal. Let's not make it a headline. Let's actually do it. That would be terrific, because we know 87% of people in apprenticeships end up on a better path and end up in better careers. And so we know what to do. We actually have to get our act together and do it. And tax reform is a part of that too.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Christina Young. I'm an MBA here at Harvard and an MBA at Wharton. I wanted to touch on the angst that you mentioned that continues to be an issue and sort of tie it to how can we invest in productivity and innovation where we're bringing people who have not felt that they have benefited from the improvement of the economy that we've seen over the last few years. The specifics of that exactly. Can we train coal miners in terms of teaching them how to do work in the clean energy space? Can we get could we, incentivize companies to move into those areas that have lost a lot of manufacturing jobs? So could we talk about the specifics? Because I'm concerned that if the way to bring blue and red America back together is making sure that people do have those jobs, but at the same time realize that the nature of those jobs are changing. So if you could speak the specifics, that'd be great.
Yeah, I think there's 2 major components to the specifics of how do we create opportunity for folks who are not feeling there's opportunity for them. And I see it in Chicago, in our south and west sides, and are working on this. I think first of all, we have to incent companies to put more of their capacity building in places, to create jobs in those communities. But most companies are not going to do that all by themselves. We're going to have to create incentives for them to do that. That's where tax policy, both at the state and federal level, could come to bear. You could imagine land policy. You could imagine a lot of things that you could use to incent corporations to create those jobs. But the other thing is we have to have training and educational system that is allowing someone, let's take our young people first, so that they're being trained towards the jobs that actually do exist and do have the potential to exist over a long period of time. And that means you've got to get involved in schools at like 5th and 6th grade as businesses and really help the families and career counselors and others understand, at 5th and 6th grade, families are making a decision about, you don't have to decide whether you're going to be a history major or you're going to be a scientist, but you do have to not preclude yourself from an option in the STEM fields and others by the coursework that you choose. We also need to make it easier to understand what's the credentialing you need for a job and who respects that credential and what are the jobs that come with that kind of training. And in fact, the BRT is going to be unveiling in a month something called Credential Engine that I think has the potential to really become a place of better understanding credentialing. The states are going to put the credentials they require, the credential providers. Stay tuned. This is a big opportunity, I think, that's happening. But those are some of the specifics of things that can be done. So I'm optimistic we can address this because it's enough people are focused, not just at the federal level, but more importantly, at the local and state level on these issues.
Thank you.
Penny, a quick follow-up. Is this an area where there can be some union between Republicans and Democrats?
Totally.
Because President Trump went to Wisconsin early in his presidency and looked at apprenticeship programs. When Chancellor Merkel came in March, the president talked to her about Germany's excellent programs of apprenticeships. Can Congress on both sides of the aisle come together on a package of reforms here?
Yes, but what's happening is also businesses need to embrace this. So, for example, believe it or not, Aon, the insurance company, and Accenture in Chicago have come together. The leadership of those two companies have come together and said, we're going to do, I forget, they've set an audacious goal of the number of apprenticeships, but it's a big number. And they're taking the leadership. And these are in service industries. Typically, we've had apprenticeships in more of our craft and skilled industries and manufacturing. Now we're taking this concept to our skilled or to our service industries, which we need to do because, frankly, we are a service economy.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Jeremy. I'm a student here and also at the business school at Stanford. And my question comes from a similar place as the other two, but I wanted to ask in particular about the role of organized labor and your comment about how a lot of the service jobs that arose coming out of the recession are lower paying, and it occurs to me that one reason for that might be that not as many of those are unionized or organized workforces, and unions with all their flaws seem to have played a big role in mitigating economic inequality and promoting shared prosperity. So I'm curious your thoughts on the role, what a re-strengthened labor movement would look like, and what you think its role is in all these questions that we've been discussing.
Yeah, I think that if you look at the pressures that are being put on labor unions in terms of forcing people to become members, and frankly, that's where it's breaking down. You have right to work states, but you also have litigation that's going on at the Supreme Court, which I assume this year will be decided 5-4 against the labor movement. I think that the opportunity is for labor unions to step back and say, how can we be more service organizations and represent our labor force and be viewed by our own workforce as value added, as opposed to political organizations or other activities that the unions play. Because I think that we're in a new era in that respect. So I think it's a rethinking of what are the goals and missions of those organizations, and how are they viewed as more and more valuable by the worker. Because it's the business community, and I think the other role is, how can you also be partners with business leadership? Business leaders don't want to have an adversarial relationship with their workforce. The workforce is, the number one asset of any company, regardless of size. They want a good working relationship. So there has to be a way to figure out, how do you come together so that work rules are working for the business leadership, and so that the unions are also, really ultimately their major focus is servicing their customer, which is the worker.
Thank you very much. Yes, right here.
Yeah, Jay Gleason. With regard to unions, though, Obama had promised organized labor that one of his first priorities would be to pass the EFCA, the Employee Free Choice Act, and he let them down. He shelved that legislation. He also let them down with regard to TPP, which they opposed because it was conducted in secret and didn't give them any input in it. Labor force participation was the lowest in 17 years under Obama, and wage growth was stagnant. So, of course, Obama, despite being a kind of faux progressive, really put business interests always ahead of labor interests throughout his 2 terms, didn't he?
I don't agree with that statement. I really don't. I think that the fight for minimum wage, I think that the fight for overtime pay, I think that in TPP, the labor standards were meant to create a more competitive labor opportunity for American workers. So I don't necessarily agree with you.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Zachary Miller. I'm a student at the college here. Bill Gates has put forward the idea of like a robot tax to like slow automation and the rapid replacement of jobs by automated technologies. What are your thoughts on that?
I think it's an interesting idea. I don't actually, to be honest, I haven't studied it, so I don't exactly understand how it would work. But I think that the idea of creating more resources for training and I'm not a supporter of universal basic income. So I would use, if you're going to tax, what are you going to use those resources for? I would pour them into training and maybe potentially creating opportunities for corporations, maybe some kind of incentive for corporations to be able to support more workforce retraining to go on. So investing in the workforce that you've got for the jobs as jobs are evolving with greater automation or greater use of artificial intelligence.
Thank you very much. We have time for 2 more questions, and we have 2 people at the mic, so it's perfectly aligned. Yes, sir.
My name is Kevin Leiby. I'm a second year MPID here at the Kennedy School. My question is about, even though 2020 is far off, what sorts of leaders or leadership qualities do you see out there in the landscape that can kind of help us right this ship, bring our discourse back, but also kind of end this partisan divide and kind of go into government and attract problem solvers back into government so we can kind of take this economy and solve all these challenges that we're going to be facing?
Well, I think the country's yearning for leadership that is both going to address the angst, the economic angst, and talk not about, every tick and tie of a policy, but are you really going to prioritize rising wages and opportunity and training for the average American? And I think likewise, I think there will be hopefully an understanding that we need to engage with the rest of the world in a number of fashions, whether it's around climate change or our own security. I mean, walking away from some of these agreements that we've talked about earlier is, I think, very much undermining our security. And unfortunately, by 2020, we may see very serious effects of all of that, not just climate or the Iran deal or DACA kids and immigration and refugees. I mean, we're walking away, UNESCO. I mean, we're walking away from the multilateral engagement that has made the United States strong and has helped stabilize the world. And hopefully we will recognize how important that is and re-engage.
Thank you for your question. Yes, sir. Last question.
My name is Andres Delaware Brust. I'm a sophomore at the college. I was wondering, in the long list of issues that you mentioned driving this change in the future of work, what the role of cities is in that. Specifically, is the international trend towards mega cities or just increasingly large cities as both in terms of population and economic power, is that an adding component to this anxiety, or is it a possible solution? I guess, do you have any views on that?
I think that young people want to live in cities. They like the excitement, and it's why I'm seeing in my own backyard our major corporations moving out of the suburbs into the city because that's where the talent is. And the talent wants to be around the amenities that big cities tend to offer, particularly in the United States. And so I think the trend towards larger megacities is one that is happening whether we like it or not. And I don't know, and certainly mayors are all about creating jobs in their cities. That's part of what they're elected to do. So they're fueling that with economic development, et cetera. So I think that, in some respects that creates angst because it means I grew up in, not me, but let's say someone grew up in a rural place. I can't find the opportunity and therefore I'm going to the city, and that may be disruptive to families, but frankly, I see your generation wanting to be in cities. I see that demand there. I don't see the demand of, I want to stay in the rural environment. And that's hard on the rural community. But there's also the problem is we're not providing the job opportunities, nor are we providing the connectivity in the rural locations. If you thought about 39% of rural communities do not have high-speed internet. So how are you expected to either get trained or do remote work if you don't have high-speed internet? So that's a place where I think there's opportunity for federal policy to say, no, we're going to cover the United States with high-speed internet. So if you want to stay in your rural community and work, there are plenty of companies today creating opportunities where you do not have to be present in order to do that work. That's an opportunity.
So Penny, at the end of our podcast today, I asked you if you're hopeful. We're facing an array of, we've talked about some big domestic challenges for the economy and for American workers. We're dealing with major challenges overseas, which we haven't talked about, but they're out there. Ash is going to have a forum here tomorrow night, to talk about the fight against the Islamic State. Are you hopeful that our country can meet these challenges, continue an upward trajectory?
I am hopeful. I think we're going through a very rough patch, and I don't know how long that will last. And I think it's very, I think one of the challenges of having been in government is you recognize what the implications are, and so that makes you even more nervous. But I'm a believer, like President Obama, in the American people. And I believe the American people have the capacity to right our ship. I mean, you have concerned citizens, you have young students here who are saying, how can I make a difference? I mean, the people that I met with all throughout today, your students, they're extraordinary, and they are not going to stay here. They're going to go back to their communities and want to make a difference. So I believe in that, but I also think we're going to have to decide, and I think we're going to have to be more active than we're used to being. I think we've taken some things for granted that we can no longer take for granted, and that may feel uncomfortable for some. I don't think we can just leave this to government. I think the American people are going to have to get more engaged in righting this ship.
Well, Penny, I said at the beginning, and I'll conclude this, in thanking you, saying thank you for being an inspiring role model for our students in your business career, in your public service, in your continued civic service and philanthropy.
Thank you.
Please join me in welcoming and thanking Penny Pritzker.